So, in talking about the crisis of consciousness in mankind, there's one word that has to be discussed and comprehended, and that word is trauma. So this channel is specifically presented just to discuss the mechanics of trauma, and it can be used as a reference. And it is that important because any greater, broader dialogue about the situation our species is in really needs the bare bones essentials of these mechanics of how trauma works in the mammalian part of our species, in our physiology. So with that in mind, I really ask you to bear with me, because this discussion cannot be underestimated or understated or undervalued. It's too relevant to what is causing our pathology as a species to bring us to the brink of our own self-annihilation and self-annihilation. So with that, I begin with why narcissism. Take for a minute the following analogy. A physical wound has occurred. Most physical wounds produce blood. A parent will tend to a bleeding wound, especially in a child, and most definitely, especially if the parent caused it, perhaps by accident. Now, however, we are talking about an emotional wound, just as harmful to the child receiving it, but there is no visible physical blood, no physical wound. The child might be bleeding to death emotionally, in fact, but the parent simply walks away from the encounter because the parent remains unaware of the emergency. Worse yet, the parent may express irritation or anger even toward the child over the encounter as he or she walks away, because by definition, that parent has just acted out of an unconscious trigger of its own, projecting his or her shame toward the child, his or her own self-loathing even. Not to elaborate tediously, but let's look at it this way. Suppose this was the accident. The parent was backing a car out of a driveway, did not see the child, and hit the child, causing it to fall, and in the process ran over one of its legs. The leg is suffering immediate trauma. Several bones just got fractured and broken. One bone has protruded through the skin and is sticking out of the leg, causing profuse bleeding. The parent gets out of the car after stopping suddenly at the thump, and in this hypothetical scenario, observes the child, and its leg returns to the driver's seat and pulls out of the driveway, and off he goes. The child is left lying on the driveway, and no one is calling an ambulance, and there are no paramedics on the way, especially no trauma paramedics, the kind needed for this kind of injury. The child goes into instinct immediately for survival. Instinct can in fact save its life. It drags itself into the house and knows to grab a towel and tie up the wound while searching for a phone to call an auntie or his or her best friend's mom for urgent help. Let's say, hypothetically again, there is no one to call and no one shows up for the child. The child will retreat to its room or its space, or withdraw, retreat, and again, its animal instincts will take over for survival. The child will in fact treat its own wound the best it can, but the truth is here that the wound will therefore never heal properly. That child might survive, but there will be horrible scarring and a massive loss of the use of one whole leg. The child will limp horribly and in the most unbalanced way through the rest of his life, the rest of his walk of life. The instincts that kicked in that enabled the child to survive will now become part of that child's permanent state of being as they kicked into response over a life and death threat. The physiology of the child will operate now on a somewhat permanent basis out of those instincts, which are animal-like in nature and very much part of all human physiology. Once they have been set on from that level of trauma to ensure survival with the continued wound and the vulnerability of the child that now becomes permanent, those instincts and neurological impulses will not relent control of the nervous system unless or until the leg is properly treated and rehabilitated. Only then can the parasympathetic system relinquish instinct for survival back to the conscious and cognitive parts of the child's brain. And only then is the child's walking ability restored, and it is no longer vulnerable in a survival sense with its life experiences and interactions. However, with this analogy and the discussion of an emotional wound just as severe, in which I previously stated there was no physical wound, there is a wound with an emotional trauma, any emotional trauma that initiates the very same physiological trauma response as with the mangled leg. The response process resides on the micro level in the nervous system, which initiates in the human brain and with the what is called vagal nerve system, and that is VAGAL. And I can't emphasize the importance of enough of knowing this simple nerve system in our body, the vagal nerve system. It's really crucial to understand how this physiological mechanism in our body works. To understand, once we're in trauma, we do go into pathological instincts and behaviors. So the same responses physiologically occur in both the scenarios of the mangled leg or an emotional wound. Blood rushing to the extremities, heightened pulse, the release of adrenaline hormones and other chemicals, rising blood pressure, all the same fight or flight mechanisms will trigger in the body, and even on into immobility, a state of self-induced paralysis, which will be discussed later. The emotions being experienced to ensure survival, fear and anger for fight and flight, will now be repressed and compressed in the physiological parasympathetic nervous system, and untreated they will become suppressed and unconscious terror and rage. Grief is also involved as the natural responses to injury and loss, and stuck in the permanent mechanism described above becomes depression, most often chronic. Now, back to the emotional wound. We need to see that this process is akin to emotional blood, emotional bleeding, yes, as those same physiological fight and flight responses have just occurred inside the body as with the outer wound, such as the leg and car example, and in this example, going unnoticed and untreated by any adults anywhere, the post-traumatic syndrome overrides normal physiological processes permanently, as there is no assistance anywhere in sight to unwind this complex survival mode. The child is now compromised and desperately needy by this injury for life, or until the proper trauma experts arrive and proper rehabilitation is given for that child's emotional wound and the accompanying neurological mechanisms known as post-trauma or stuck trauma response, if you will, since it most likely will not be given the trauma care it needs, it remains in need itself, for it cannot go through the proper discharge process to release trauma and cannot restore to the balance of normal neurological functioning without trained and expert assistance. It will therefore become impossible for that child to walk in balance in life and nurture others. Again, fight or flight trauma triggers three primary emotions: anger, fear, and grief. Untreated, they are physiologically repressed in the child and will therefore be expressed as dominant emotions in interactions with others. Because as expressed above, the parasympathetic nervous system will remain on autopilot for survival until emergency help arrives and treatment begins. Emotional relationships, therefore, will be dominated by the permanent undercurrent of these emotions: anger, fear, and grief, and what we know as psychological dysfunction is now established. Fight or flight is the term used when a million life and death situation has occurred. Our species has prepared us with these three emotions accompanying fight or flight to survive a life-threatening attack. Again, they are fear, anger, and grief. These three emotions combined drive the impulses for survival. Untreated, along with the other symptoms of stuck injury, the complex of symptoms is known scientifically as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. There is a spectrum of charge according to the level of threat or injury. Some are very minor, while others are perceived by the organism as literal death threat. The level of charge is referred to as voltage. If the injury is systematic and repeated, the trauma response becomes more deeply embedded. Wherever on that spectrum the injury and trauma lies, the neediness and the painful emotions of rage, terror, and grief of the person lies with it, along with the level of voltage according to the injury experienced. The person has no conscious choice about its neediness. It is stuck in a vulnerable position physiologically and can do nothing about it and cannot control those impulses that become the dominant emotional landscape of its expression. It is focused on that wound in a permanent way without being conscious of the parasympathetic focus. It is locked into a state of survival only, not of growth. It focuses all its life energy on the mostly unconscious physiological impulses that have taken over its brain and mind. It becomes acutely self-focused. As it is in a permanent state of vulnerability, it therefore develops chronic need, and with urgent consistency takes from others to ensure its survival. It thereby loses the ability for growth and giving to others at every state of being level. When we are talking about the untreated emotional victim bleeding to death, almost literally needing others' blood to replace its own lost blood, or other life and vital forces to replace its leaking lost vital forces, we are confronted with the narcissist. Welcome to narcissism. It is not inappropriate to refer to this state of being as personality disorder in general. Psychologically, there may be subtle differences in other sets of diagnostic descriptives to explain the symptoms of the emotional wound or wounds, and those range from anxiety disorders to histrionic and antisocial disorders to the schizoid disorder realm. It is my personal intuition as of this writing that narcissism best explains a universal pattern designed into the fabric of our society, civilization itself, that best describes the plight of our species. So I focus on the conversation regarding narcissism as a way to understand where we have gone so wrong as a species. This shall be elaborated on throughout this specific study, the study of narcissism.